Hey there, I'd just like to ask before the video starts, if you like what you see, please give us a click on the like and subscribe buttons. Hi everybody. Well, my guest today is the niece of one of Newfoundland and Labrador's first internationally recognized novelists. In fact, she was the first internationally recognized novelist. Her name, Margaret Iris Duley, and her niece has written a very fine book about her Aunt Margaret. It's called Extraordinary Passages, and many of you may already be aware of Margaret Iris Duley's writing. Some of her novels include The Eyes of the Gull, Highway to Valor, and Cold Pastoral. It's my pleasure to welcome her niece, the author Margot Duley, to the program. Welcome, Margot.
Thank you so much, Karl, and thank you for having me back again.
Well, I'm delighted because I knew you were writing this book, and I said, I've got to have you back when this book comes out. Because I am a fan of Margaret Iris Duley.
Fabulous.
I have read The Eyes of the Gull and Cold Pastoral, which are the only two books I was able to get my hands on. Yeah. I'd love to read the other ones, but anyway, she was an extraordinary writer. And but first I want to ask you, Margaret was born in the latter part of the 19th century, the latter years. She grew up at a time when women were afraid to show their intelligence. But she wasn't afraid, was she?
She certainly wasn't. And I think ultimately she paid a bit of a price for it. It's so hard to sort out how much is nature and how much is nurture. But by nature, I would say Margaret was quite rebellious. There's a very amusing picture of her. In fact, I have it in the book. She's all decked out in her beautiful, fluffy white dress. But the look on her face is one of total rebellion. And then if you blow up the picture and look at her little shoes, her little boots, they are just covered with dust. So, and I think her mother, Tryphena, was quite exasperated by her even when she was a child. But she also had some formative influences and kind of a very remarkable teacher that she had when she was probably about 5 years old. A woman who wasn't formally trained in teaching, a Mrs. Burt, who just encouraged her imagination. Mrs. Burt was brought up in Cape Breton and was just immersed in Highland folklore and Sir Walter Scott. And Margaret was like a sponge. And her creativity and her flights of imagination were encouraged, I think, by Mrs. Burt in a way that weren't encouraged in her very strict evangelical household.
Now, Margaret spent a lot of time living in Carbonear with her outport relatives, her maternal relatives, and this experience influenced her greatly, didn't it?
It did. She really saw Newfoundland from a series of angles, and Carbonear was one of them. She wasn't just exposed to kind of the St. John's elite, and so much of the previous writing about her kind of situates her as an elite jeweler's daughter in St. John's, but that's really just part of her life. Her mother, Tryphena, came from a struggling fishing family in Carbonear, and Tryphena was sent to town as a very young girl to live with an aunt, her mother's sister, and received an excellent education. In fact, she got a first-class teaching certificate, the highest available in Newfoundland at the time. But the family stayed in close touch. And Margaret would spend at least part of her summers, as did the other children, in Carbonear. And because Carbonear wasn't that remote from St. John's, I mean, there was a railway by the time Margaret was a child, there were reciprocal visits. So she was very aware of the struggles and lives of her relatives in Carbonear.
So,
and they made quite an impression upon her.
So, in one or two of her books especially, these outport experiences really show up.
Yes, they do.
Just talk about that.
Well, there are three relatives in particular that actually form the basis of characters in her book. And Margaret greatly admired all of them. One was her own grandmother, Julia Soper, who was left widowed at a very early age with, I think it was 4 or 5 children. She'd already lost 2 children to typhoid and other diseases. And then her husband went through a long and lingering and financially depleting illness. And I discovered grandmother Julia in the merchant ledgers of the Rourke firm, trying to carry on her husband's fishing operation in Labrador as a widow. And she returns with her fall catch, earning 1 shilling 6pence. And yet she was a woman of, as Margaret remembered her and depicted her, of enormous courage, a very mystical sense of religion that ultimately strong hands held her up. Margaret describes her as with a back bent from her own maintenance because she was gardening. And that kind of indomitable spirit, in sense of enormous tragedy and difficulty, affected Margaret's view of the outward character. She really, in a number of her books, she contrasts kind of an enduring strength of character in the outports and contrasts this, rather wickedly at times, with the kind of enervating effects of affluence in St. John's. So Carbonear affects her sense of the Newfoundland character. It also affects the detail with which she writes about outports. Really just reading a couple of pages of an outport setting, and you realize this is not a privileged girl sitting in a dining room in St. John's all her life. The analogies she uses, the metaphors she uses,
exactly,
are just draw on outport life continually.
Yes. Now, she received her formal education at the Methodist College.
She did.
Which was the college, I think, of her era, made so by Robert Edwards Holloway, I think. And not only did she come away with this marvelous education, but she made marvelous friends there, and both kind of were with her for the rest of her life,
They were, yes. I would say, though, that the college primarily stressed the education of young men. It's gained a reputation for forward thinking, as indeed it deserves in some respects. It was very advanced in the teaching of science. It was also co-educational, which was highly unusual in St. John's. Of course, it would have been the norm in an outport or in working class schools in St. John's, but it was co-educational. But if you look at the curriculum, it does not encourage young women to succeed. In fact, they have to sacrifice academic subjects for things like needlework. If you look at what a young girl had to do at the end of her graduation from the Methodist College and other college or schools in St. John's, it's remarkable. They had to be able to sew drawers. They had to be able to, do advanced knitting and needlework, etc., which is lovely, but they sacrificed history, they sacrificed science and other core academic subjects. But I think what carried Margaret through ultimately is 2 things. One, she actually got diphtheria as a child, and she spent a lot of time at home reading. She was a voracious reader. She was bored at school, but she was a voracious reader in a wide variety of subjects, and that stuck with her for the rest of her life. But the other influence of the Methodist College were some remarkable schoolmates who, in some ways, were in rebellion against their own education, too. two sisters, the Muse sisters. Gwendolyn went on to become a leading Cubist painter, arguably the first woman to become a professor in the history of Newfoundland. She became a professor of painting in the United States and went on to form a Western school of women painters that are recognized to this day in the West, in Colorado. But they stayed in touch. Her sister, Eleanor Muse, later Jarrett, who studied opera, she was destined probably to be a very accomplished mezzo-soprano, but then a fire, it was a log, I think, or cinders from a fireplace flew out onto her, caught her clothes on fire, and she had scars on her hand and her neck. And so ultimately she didn't go on stage, but she taught music at a very high level and formed the Glee Club movement in Newfoundland, including the Memorial College's
Is it fair to
first
say, though,
choirs.
that when Margaret was at the Methodist College, that she at least came away with some writing skills?
She did, and she read the classics. She was just immersed in Victorian writers, pre-Raphaelite writers, and that love of literature certainly stuck with her. And the one distinction she won at school, mostly her marks were not terribly good, was a distinction in English. Clearly that's what she resonated to.
Now, at one point in her life, when she was a young woman, a girl still, she decided that her career would be in the theater.
Yes, she did.
And she pursued that, and in fact went off to study in England, didn't she?
She did.
Yeah.
Which was an unusual choice, to say the least, for a girl of her class in St. John's. And it says something, I think, about her inner strength to have even attempted it. But she went to the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Arts, which was one of the leading drama schools in England.
Still is.
Still is. She studied with Charles Fry, who was a well-known drama teacher at the time. Sometimes, because of a given received riff about Margaret, that she's just this privileged child, it's assumed that she studied elocution, but she didn't. She studied drama, the full drama curriculum. And even though she left after a year, she was there at the time of the suffrage marches, the height of suffragette agitation in England. And it's clear that she absorbed those messages, and also, I'm not sure she ever went to class. I think she immersed herself in the West End theater and opera, and it was a tremendous liberal arts education
But
for
she
her.
had to give it up because of the outbreak of World War I.
Yes. Extraordinarily, her father, really in advance of Newfoundland newspapers, who were not really watching what was happening in Europe, the assassination of the Grand Duke. Her father got very concerned that there was going to be a world war, and he went back to England and told her he was taking her back home. And so she ends up back in St. John's.
And she was, Margot, she was profoundly affected by World War I, wasn't she?
She was.
Yeah.
That and the suffrage movement, I think, were really the formative influences on her life. But World War I, I mean, we know the story of what a tragedy it was for Newfoundland as a whole.
Yes.
The Duley family is really a microcosm of that tragedy. There's scarcely a member of the family that isn't affected in some way. Her brother Cyril was very badly wounded and suffered physical pain periodically for the rest of his life. Her brother Lionel was killed in a Battle of Kyburg Ridge, which is now largely forgotten, but Margaret didn't forget it, and in fact Captain Frost, who participated in it, wrote a kind of expose of all of the errors that had gone into that battle. It kind of reminds you of Beaumont Hamel, and what a tragedy it was. And Lionel lost his life there. Her fiancé, died from lingering war wounds. As she saw it, I'm not sure there's medical proof of this, but it's how she interpreted it. Her father dies of a broken heart. He was already ill.
Yeah.
And on it goes. And I might add, Karl, at one point, I started to count up the number of young men that she knew either at her church in the neighborhood or had gone to school with her or whatever in St. John's who had died. And I got to 120, and I was so overcome myself. I said, I can't keep counting.
And all of these experiences she had, everything in her life really, in terms of her writing, was grist for the mill, wasn't it?
It was. So World War I turns up in her novels continually, but especially in Highway to Valor, which is really a rumination about how does a human face a complete catastrophe. In this case, it's a tsunami down on the Burin Peninsula. But it's really a rumination on, in an indirect sort of way, on the effects of World War I. How do you lose everything, including your faith, which she did lose for a time, and all the people you love, and carry on? How do you find that courage to continue? So it finds its way there.
Now, during the 1920s, there was something of a cultural awakening in Newfoundland in writing, literature, music, history, and so on and so forth. And Margaret was very much involved in that, wasn't she?
She was. The two or three women that I think of in this period are Florence Miller out in Topsail, who astoundingly has basically a literary salon called the Blue Castle. And there's at least indirect evidence that Margaret attended it. It's not absolutely provable, but there's some evidence she did. A poet, Nina Brown, who's now very neglected, was another part of that circle. And in both instances, they draw on Newfoundland imagery, Newfoundland folk dialect. They're writing about what they see at hand rather than about England, about home, about Europe. And so it's really kind of an affirmation of Newfoundland as a place that's worth studying and writing about.
Talk about the fact that Margaret was always searching for the deeper meaning of life.
Yes, she was.
And how this was reflected in her writing.
Yeah, it's there in all of her books. And again, to get back to World War I, in many ways she reflects a much broader intellectual trend in the West of disillusionment with Christianity after World War I. And as Margaret saw it, both sides, whether it was Great Britain and its allies or Germany and its allies, had clergy on both sides arguing that their respective sides are carrying out God's will, and young men were to go out and kill each other. That's the way she sees it and frames it. And so she looks for an alternative to traditional Christianity. She's also restive because she sees that Christianity, as she is experiencing it, is constraining towards women. It's slotting them into a purely domestic kind of role in the world, and she's very restive with that. And there's also a sexual double standard, that women's sexual behavior gets condemned, but men's is kind of ignored. And so all of these things lead to a disillusionment. So each of her books, you can read, they're wonderful tales, even if you don't look for a deeper meaning. They're great yarns.
They are.
But there's always a deeper meaning, that the character is searching for a meaning in life, or a new ethical code, or for a higher power that's non-doctrinal to carry them through difficulty. And that's just kind of a subtext in all of her books. And it's more than a subtext in Highway to Valor.
Now, sadly, her last book was rejected by her then publisher, Macmillan.
Yes.
And nobody's ever really found out from Macmillan why they rejected it. And I don't think Margaret had a lot to say. about it, but she destroyed the manuscript. What's your theory on why her book was rejected by Macmillan?
Well, I think I've developed a plausible theory, and it's not entirely a theory because I have found some facts to back it up. But part of the manuscript survived because my mother rescued it.
Oh.
Margaret threw it in a mixture of despair and anger and disillusionment into a fireplace, but apparently not all the pages got in. And Mother swept them up. So you can see the
Being
tenor.
a theatrical person, that was quite a dramatic...
It was. She was very dramatic in real life.
I don't mean to make light of it.
No, she was very charismatic. I mean, she really was hilarious at times. She was larger in life, especially in living rooms when she took one over. But no, my mother rescued some pages. And so you can see the tenor of the book from that. But also, I went into the Macmillan archives that are at McMaster University in Ontario. And I found hints in the papers of her editors about what it was. And it was clear it was a book about warfare. And it's pretty clear to me from the fragments that what she's doing is rejecting a kind of militaristic view of the world in favor of a more pacifistic form. And the contrivance, the literary contrivance, is that the heroine has to choose between two suitors. One is, as she puts it, a flyboy who rushes into the latest war, which is World War II. The other is a soldier who's a poet, who's having doubts about it. And the heroine has to choose. And ultimately, she chooses the poet. And the whole plot isn't there, but it's the hint as to why it's rejected is Macmillan told her the public would not stand for this. And really what it is, I think, is a book that ruminates on human nature and why we fall into wars and questions it. And she sends this manuscript to Macmillan in the later part of 1943, just as the Allies are getting ready for their final push against Germany. Conscription is being debated in Canada, and there could not have been a worse time to ruminate about causes.
Timing is everything.
Timing is everything, yeah.
The late, eminent Memorial University professor George Story once posed the question, how did Margaret Iris Duley avoid suffocating in the little mercantile colonial world of St. John's? How would you answer that?
I think about this a lot in the book. I think there are a number of reasons why she wasn't suffocated. Perhaps there wasn't enough room to truly flourish. But part of it was the circle of friends she had. And I think it's a bit reductionist to see St. John's purely as a mercantile society only concerned with balancing books rather than reading them, which is one of George Story's marvelous phrases. She had a circle of friends that really supported her. Some of them I've already mentioned. They came from her time at Methodist College. Carrie Story, another one of them, who was a sportswoman who threw off all of the constraining advice for women not to exercise themselves too much and dominates golf in Newfoundland. In fact, she's the first Newfoundlander of either sex to go play in the Canadian Open Golf Championship. But there were also people like Sidney Bennett and Winifred Bennett, who I can only describe as glamorous. Sidney was a hero of World War I. He had the Croix de Guerre for kind of exploits in the air that make, Hollywood movies look pale in comparison. And then there's Winifred Bennett, later Bride and Jack, who I was told as a child had danced with Pavlova, the leading Russian ballerina. And when I wrote the book, I thought, this is fanciful. How could this possibly be? And so I contacted relatives. Indeed, she did. She didn't just dance with Pavlova. She was one of the principal ballerinas in Pavlova's company. And Sidney fell in love with her. He saw her on the stage in New York. It's impossibly romantic. He has a plane of his own after World War I. He pursues her. It's the ultimate stage Giorgiani, only in a plane, from performance to performance, and persuades her to marry him and come back to St. John's. They were well-read. They were sophisticated. When Margaret was criticized at one point, I was told, by people in St. John's, Sidney Bennett silenced the room and defended her. So she has these passionate defenders who believe in what she's doing, that balances out some of the negativity that surrounded her as a person.
Margot, we're out of time. I could talk to you for another half hour, but anyway, I highly recommend your book to our viewers, Extraordinary Passages by Margot Duley. And I also highly recommend that you try to find a novel by Margaret Iris Duley and read it if you haven't, because you're in for a treat. Thanks so much, Margot.
Thank you, Karl.
And we'll see you all again next time.